My name is Allison Carter, 33 years old, living in Philadelphia. For years, I believed I was a devoted daughter, someone who knew how to sacrifice to please her mother. But the cruel truth was that all my efforts were met only with disdain, cold stares, and words that shattered my heart. My mother, Margaret, never once looked at me with pride. Instead, she always found a reason to criticize. My childhood was never filled with warm hugs or gentle praise. It was marked by sighs of disappointment and bitter comparisons. When I brought home a crayon drawing, hoping she would smile and stick it on the fridge like other mothers, she frowned and tossed it into the trash. "You call this messy scribble worth showing off? Allison, you need to learn to do better." I remember every one of those moments like tiny blades carving into my memory. Anytime I tried to dress in my own style, she would drag me to the mirror and snap, "Who would ever notice you looking so plain? A daughter in this house has to protect her mother's reputation." When I lowered my head in shame, she would press harder, "Stand up straight. Don't hunch your back like some useless girl." Her grip on my shoulders left red marks, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the wound inside. The only person who was always gentle and believed in me was my father, David Carter. He was my only comfort. Every time I brought home a good grade or an essay I had poured myself into, he smiled warmly, the corners of his eyes crinkling with pride. "That's my bright girl." Just those few words were enough to make me feel worthy of love. In his eyes, I always mattered. He often pulled me into his arms and whispered, "Don't pay attention to what your mother says. Just be yourself, that's more than enough." In those moments, the world felt lighter. He was my shield against her venomous words. But life is rarely fair. When I had just turned 11, tragedy struck on a summer afternoon. I found my father collapsed in our backyard. His face was pale, his hand cold in mine. I screamed for help and neighbors rushed over, pressing on his chest, while I shook uncontrollably, my vision blurred with tears. The flashing ambulance lights lit up the street, but nothing could bring him back. My father was gone forever from a heart attack without even a last goodbye. The scene at the hospital still haunts me. I remember clearly when my mother walked in, her eyes dry, and the first thing she said wasn't grief. It was, "Allison, why didn't you watch him more carefully? You knew his heart was weak. You're partly responsible for this." That accusation cut through me like a knife, planting the seed of guilt I carried for years. From the day my father died, my life became a desperate race for my mother's approval. I buried myself in studies, joined clubs, fought for perfect grades. I thought that if I became the best, she would finally see me differently. But no, every achievement was crushed beneath her comparisons. "The neighbor's daughter is still better. Don't fool yourself." I knew that from the moment I lost my father, I also lost the only person who truly protected me. All that remained was a mother who saw me as a shadow, a burden that was never good enough. And from that point on, I began living with a gnawing doubt. Was I ever worthy of love, or was I nothing more than a thorn in her eyes? When I entered my teenage years, I carried a naive belief that if I just tried harder, my mother would change. Reality, however, poured cold water over that fragile hope. At parent-teacher meetings, my friends' parents praised and encouraged them. My mother, on the other hand, sat with her arms crossed, her face cold, and said loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "These grades aren't enough. The neighbor's daughter has scored perfect 10s far more times." I still remember the humiliation that burned through me, a shame that haunted me for years. Even when I became an honor student, she never truly smiled. She always found a way to diminish my achievements. "Allison, do you know Emily, my friend's daughter, just got accepted to Harvard? You only got into Penn State. That's nothing." I bit my tongue, swallowing my tears, afraid that showing weakness would make her despise me even more. On my college graduation day, a milestone most students dream of sharing with their families, she claimed to have a headache and stayed home. When I looked into the stands, the seats reserved for my family were empty. Amid the cheers of parents for their children, I walked the stage in silence, clutching my diploma with both pride and bitterness. Later, when I called her, her voice was dry. "What good is a degree if you don't even know how to choose the right path?" My chest tightened as if all those years of effort meant nothing. It wasn't just academics. My love life became another target for her sabotage. At 22, I dated Daniel, a dedicated medical student. My friends adored him, and for the first time I felt genuinely valued. But at our very first dinner, my mother's words cut like glass. She glanced at him and smirked. Hard to believe Allison actually caught someone's attention. She's always been so awkward with men. I froze. Less than a week later, Daniel walked away. Only much later did I discover that my mother had called him, claiming I had emotional issues and needed years of therapy. The same story repeated with Thomas when I was 26, then Andrew at 29. Each time love began to bloom, she sowed doubt, until the men I cared for became strangers. When I confronted her, she simply shrugged. I'm only protecting you from mistakes. You always choose the wrong kind of men. Slowly, I realized my happiness had never been her concern. I threw myself into work, becoming a financial advisor at a major firm in downtown Philadelphia. After years of relentless dedication, I rose to senior advisor. Wealthy clients trusted me to manage millions of dollars in their portfolios. I bought a sleek condo in Rittenhouse Square and built a stable life, believing my mother would finally acknowledge me. But she didn't. In her eyes, everything I did was meaningless. Allison, you work yourself to exhaustion just to make other people richer. Why don't you find a successful man to depend on instead? She said casually, dismissing my entire career as if it were wasted effort. I clenched my teeth, swallowing the bitterness, while still quietly covering her medical bills, property taxes, and even the luxury vacations she demanded. For years, I supported her, a woman who hadn't worked a single day since my father's death. Every expense, from the car she drove to the utilities in her house, fell on my shoulders. Yet instead of gratitude, she treated it as my duty. Whenever I grew weary, she reminded me coldly, I gave birth to you and raised you. Now it's your turn to pay me back. That's all. Every word was another chain tightening around me, dragging me back into the cycle of guilt that began the day my father died. I kept providing, convincing myself that someday she would change. But deep down I knew, her approval would never come. And just when I thought things couldn't possibly get worse, I walked straight into another trap, preparing for her special birthday celebration. I had spent months preparing for my mother's 65th birthday. I thought that if I poured every ounce of effort into it, she would finally recognize the love I had tried so hard to give. I reserved a private room at a fine restaurant in downtown Philadelphia, one she had once praised for its menu and service. I decorated it with white roses and hydrangeas, the very flowers she used to plant in our front yard when I was a child. I even hired a professional photographer and arranged a custom menu with perfectly medium-rare steaks and a fine Cabernet, the wine she always enjoyed sipping at night. But the most special gift I kept hidden until the end: a piece of jewelry. It was an old emerald bracelet that my grandmother had left to me before she passed. I had taken it to a well-known jeweler to have it fully restored, replacing the clasp with white gold. I believed that when she opened that velvet box, she would be moved to tears and finally admit she was proud of me. That evening, I arrived an hour early to check on everything. The restaurant manager smiled and said, "You're incredibly thoughtful. Your mother must be very lucky." I nodded, hiding the storm of nerves inside me. Guests began to arrive. My mother's longtime friends walked in, marveling at the setup. "Allison, you're such a wonderful daughter. Margaret is so fortunate." I forced a smile, silently praying they were right. At exactly 7 p.m. my mother appeared. She wore the black dress I had gifted her last Christmas, her silver hair neatly styled. When I moved to hug her, she turned her cheek for a perfunctory kiss, and her first words were, "Allison, the parking here is too cramped. Next time, pick somewhere more convenient." I swallowed my disappointment and smiled to cover it. The dinner carried on with her laughter among her friends, while I faded into the background, only acknowledged when she needed a dish sent back or wanted me to flag down a server. I kept calm, reminding myself that the moment I gave her the bracelet would change everything. Before dessert, I stood holding the small velvet box, my heart pounding. Taking a deep breath, I said, "Mom, I want to give you something truly meaningful for your birthday." I handed her the box. Every eye turned toward her. She opened it, the emeralds sparkling under the light, casting a vivid green glow. The room filled with murmurs of admiration. But she only glanced at it briefly before snapping the lid shut with a cold flick of her wrist. "This should have been mine from the start. Your grandmother favored you far too much." Her voice was flat, without the slightest trace of emotion. The chatter in the room died instantly, replaced by a heavy silence. I stood frozen, my hands trembling as I lowered them. When the cake was brought out, everyone sang. My mother smiled at her friends, then raised her glass. Her voice carried across the room. Thank you all for coming tonight. As we grow older, we come to value only the relationships that are real. And if I could wish for a gift, it would be freedom, from burdens from those who never bring me joy. Then her eyes locked onto mine. Each word sliced into me like a blade. The greatest gift would be for you to leave my life forever. The room went still. Some guests lowered their heads, others glanced at me awkwardly. My face burned as though on fire. It felt like a public sentence handed down without appeal. I searched her face, hoping she was joking, but she wasn't. Her smile was icy, her gaze hollow. I sat down, my fists clenched so tightly my nails dug into my skin. The singing faded, the sweet scent of cake was lost on me. All I could hear was the echo of her words over and over. Leave my life. That night as I drove her home, the car was silent. Before stepping out, she said coolly, the dinner was adequate, but the restaurant wasn't fitting. Next time, pick a better place. Summoning all my courage, I asked, Mom, did you really mean what you said? She turned back, her voice detached. Allison, you're too sensitive. If you take everything personally, that's on you. But yes, I've never found this relationship fulfilling. I did my duty raising you. What you do with your life now is no longer my concern. The car door slammed, leaving me stunned in the driver's seat. At that moment, clarity struck me harder than ever. I had been chasing an illusion for 3 decades. No gift, no sacrifice could ever make my mother love me. And right there, the harshest truth shattered inside me. The maternal love I had longed for had never existed. That night, I lay motionless on my bed, streetlights casting pale beams through the window, shadows stretching across the luxury condo I had once been so proud to own. But inside me, there was only emptiness and crushing humiliation. My mother's words echoed, the greatest gift would be for you to leave my life forever. In that moment, I realized if I kept clinging to this relationship, my entire life would remain nothing more than a shadow steeped in her contempt. When dawn broke, I made my decision. I would disappear from my mother's world. No longer her source of money, no longer her crutch, no longer the name she could use as a target for blame. I wanted freedom. I took out a large notebook and wrote down every step. First, I called my supervisor and requested 2 weeks off for urgent personal reasons. I had always been a dedicated employee, never taking extended leave, so my request was immediately approved. Next, I called an old acquaintance in real estate, Mark Sanders, a broker who had once asked for my financial advice. I told him bluntly, Mark, I want to sell my condo immediately. No public listings, no open houses. Find me a cash buyer, even if it's below market value. He hesitated, but I held firm. I knew I needed a clean, decisive break with no ties left behind. By noon, I was seated in the office of Gregory Lee, my trusted financial advisor. I spread stacks of documents across his desk. Bank accounts, credit cards, insurance policies, automatic payments. I want to sever every financial tie between me and my mother. Immediately. Gregory frowned. Allison, are you certain? This is a big step. I've never been more certain, I replied, my voice steady. We spent hours combing through every detail. I froze joint accounts, canceled all recurring payments, property taxes, utilities, medical bills, everything I had covered for her over the last decade. I also updated beneficiaries on my insurance and retirement accounts, erasing her name completely. It felt like cutting invisible strings one by one, leaving emptiness but also a strange sense of relief. Leaving the bank, I drove straight to the post office and registered for a P.O. box. From now on, important mail would come only to me. Then I called every service I had arranged under my name for her. Lawn care, home security, even housekeeping. All were cancelled. I wanted no door left open for her to pull me back. That evening, I began packing. I chose carefully. Personal documents, a few changes of clothes, and a handful of keepsakes tied to my father. A weathered pocket watch and some old family photos. The expensive, soulless possessions. The Italian dining set, the art pieces I had bought only to impress my mother. I left behind. I realized most of what I owned was never really for me, but to prove to her that I was successful. None of it mattered anymore. By dawn, I sat at my desk writing a letter to my mother. I wrote and tore up drafts again and again, until finally I settled on words that were short and clear. Mom, you once said the greatest gift would be for me to leave your life. Today I give you that gift. From now on, every expense, every responsibility is yours. I am no longer your wallet, no longer your scapegoat. This isn't out of hatred but out of acceptance. I let go. Don't look for me. Allison. I slid the envelope under her door and walked away without looking back. For the first time in years, my steps didn't tremble. In the days that followed, my plan unfolded smoothly. Mark found a cash buyer within a week, willing to pay 12% below market value. I didn't regret it. What I needed wasn't money but a clean severance. I opened a new bank account, got a new phone number, deleted every social media account. One morning, I loaded my car with luggage and drove west. No clear destination, only the certainty that the farther I left Philadelphia behind, the lighter my heart felt. After days on the road through Ohio and Illinois, I stopped in Seattle. The city cloaked in fog and rain somehow felt like a fresh start. I rented a small apartment in Queen and overlooking Puget Sound. Nothing extravagant, nothing elaborate, just simple and peaceful. I furnished it myself. A soft armchair, a small bookshelf, ocean blue curtains. For the first time, every choice was mine, not dictated by anyone else's taste. For the first time, the home I lived in truly belonged to me. Within weeks, I found a position at a mid-sized investment firm specializing in ethical funds, a field I had never been allowed to explore before. During the interview, my future boss, Janet Miller, smiled and said, "We're looking for people who put people above numbers." I nearly cried. Never had I felt so seen. At night, I sat by my window listening to the steady rain, filled with a peace I had never known. For the first time in my life, I was no longer living to please my mother. I was living for myself. In those first days in Seattle, I felt like someone who had just escaped a violent storm. Everything was so quiet that sometimes I jolted awake in the middle of the night, bracing for the sound of my mother's voice, scolding, demanding, criticizing. But there was nothing, only the steady tapping of rain against the window. In that silence, I began learning how to listen to myself. The very first thing I did was find a therapist. I booked an appointment with Dr. Susan Matthews, a psychologist specializing in family trauma. At our very first session, she looked at me and said gently, "Allison, sometimes leaving isn't selfish. It's the only path to healing." Her words tore through the veil of guilt I had carried for so long. Every week, I returned to her office. At first, I could do nothing but sit quietly, crying as I thought of my childhood or of my father. But little by little, I learned to put words to it all. The humiliation at family parties, the loneliness of graduating without a parent in the stands, the relationships sabotaged with a single manipulative phone call. I once thought speaking of it would destroy me, but instead, the act of voicing it gave my wounds air, allowing them to stop festering in silence. Matthews encouraged me to build a new social life, even in small steps. I joined a community book club at the library, then signed up for a weekend hiking group. At first, I hung back awkwardly, but I realized no one here knew me as the daughter who was never enough. They only saw a new Allison, friendly, approachable, genuine. One late autumn trip with the hiking group led us into Olympic National Forest. The air was crisp, the trees wrapped in heavy mist, the freshness so pure I felt renewed from within. That was where I met Ethan Parker, a high school English teacher. He had kind eyes and a calm, steady voice. When I slipped on the damp trail, he reached out to steady me, smiling softly, "Take it slow, no one's racing here." We started talking first about books and favorite hiking trails. But the more we spoke, the more I was startled by the ease I felt. No second-guessing what my mother would think of him, no fear of being judged. With Ethan, I could simply be myself. Our dates were never extravagant. A warm cup of coffee in a tiny cafe in Capitol Hill. An afternoon walk along Lake Union, watching white sailboats drift lazily across the water. I had never experienced simplicity that felt so comforting. When Ethan took me to meet his family in Tacoma, it was like stepping into another world. His parents debated politics but laughed together moments later. His sister cooked dinner while kids dashed around the table, even tugging the tablecloth without anyone yelling. As I was leaving, his mother hugged me and whispered, "Thank you for coming." Ethan looked so happy. I froze in disbelief. In 33 years, no one had ever told me that my presence brought joy. Of course, the scars remained. Once when Ethan said, "I love you," I panicked and avoided him for an entire week. But instead of anger, he simply texted, I'll be here whenever you're ready. His patience showed me something my mother never had. Love isn't a power game. Real love is choosing to stay without conditions. Through therapy and through Ethan, I learned something I had never believed in my life. My worth didn't depend on my mother's approval. I didn't need anyone to prove I was enough. I already was and always had been, simply because I was me. At night, I often sat by the window of my small apartment, gazing at the lights reflecting off the water. I sipped my tea feeling light inside. I knew there were still challenges ahead. But for the first time I wasn't afraid. I had stepped out of my mother's shadow. As I was slowly rebuilding my life in Seattle, on the other side of the country, my mother, Margaret, began to taste the consequences of the dependency she had created for herself over so many years. In the first days after I disappeared, she still believed I would return, just as I had after every scolding in the past. But as time passed, the bills piled up, the steady deposits into her bank account stopped, and everything began to collapse. The old house in the Philadelphia suburbs, the one she always bragged about as a symbol of the family's class, suddenly became a massive burden. Property taxes, maintenance fees, utilities, all of which I had always covered, were no longer paid. Within 2 months, she received foreclosure warnings from the bank about overdue mortgage payments. Panicked, she called everyone she could, but no one knew where I was. Worse, she had lived lavishly for years, recklessly charging expenses to her credit cards. Now, nearly $45,000 of debt spread across multiple cards was closing in on her. The compounding interest left her unable to keep up. Collection calls came relentlessly, and all she could do was shout into the phone, "My daughter will handle it. She's just busy." But this time I truly wasn't coming back. Her health also began to deteriorate. She had a history of high blood pressure, and now stress and endless sleepless nights pushed her further down. One afternoon, an elderly neighbor found her collapsed in the kitchen and rushed her to the hospital. The doctor diagnosed a panic attack coupled with hypertension, warning that her condition could become dangerous if she didn't change her lifestyle. In the hospital, for the first time, Margaret lost her air of authority and biting tone. She sat quietly, alone, with no one at her side. Many of the friends who had once attended her grand birthday party faded away once they realized she no longer had money to host lavish gatherings. Back at her house, flooded with bills and debt notices, she was forced to face the truth. Her comfortable life had only ever existed because of me. Without me, she had nothing left to lean on. One of her few loyal friends, Helen, convinced her to attend a support group called Parents Estranged from Adult Children, a space for parents cut off by their kids. At first, Margaret went only to complain, painting me as an ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her mother. But as she listened to the stories of others, she began to recognize herself in them. Parents who controlled, belittled, and never valued their children's love. Gradually, she grew quiet, no longer spewing blame. One of the group facilitators said something that broke her. "We are not abandoned because our children are cruel. We are abandoned because we did not know how to love them properly." From then on, Margaret attended regularly. She learned to handle basic tasks she had once left entirely to me: paying bills, grocery shopping, budgeting. She even started keeping a journal at the advice of a therapist, writing down the things she had done and said to me. Confronting those words brought her to tears. For the first time in her life, she admitted she had been wrong. One night in March, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. Later I learned it belonged to Helen. Attached was a handwritten letter from Margaret. I sat staring at the envelope for hours before finally opening it. Her handwriting shook, nothing like the polished script I remembered. "Allison, I was angry with you for leaving me. But now I understand, you left because it was the only way for both of us to escape the toxic cycle. I lived selfishly, always demanding without giving. I envied the bond you had with your father and took it out on you. I was wrong. This house is about to be sold. I no longer have the strength to keep it. But losing the house isn't as terrifying as losing you. I've joined a support group. I'm learning to change, to start over. Not so you'll come back and take care of me, but so that at least when I look in the mirror, I won't only see a woman who ruined everything. I don't expect forgiveness right away. I just want you to know that for the first time in my life, I truly feel regret. Margaret." My hands trembled as I finished reading. For years, I had longed for acknowledgement, for an apology. But when it finally arrived, my heart didn't swell. It sank heavy with doubt. I didn't know if I should believe her, or if this was simply another tactic to pull me back. I folded the letter and tucked it away in my desk. A part of me yearned to believe my mother had truly changed. But another part whispered a warning. Scars carved this deep cannot heal with just a few pages of remorse. A year had passed since I vanished from Philadelphia. In Seattle, I had built a new life. A steady job, a circle of genuine friends, and a relationship that taught me how to trust again. Yet deep inside, my mother Margaret's apology letter still sat untouched in my desk drawer, like a wound that refused to close. I had read it over and over but never once replied. The following spring, my firm sent me to Boston for a financial conference. Before the trip, I wrestled with a question. Should I take the chance to see my mother? Matthews, my therapist, only offered gentle advice. Do what you feel ready for. No one can force Allison to face something before she wants to. But as the plane descended into Boston, the city emerging through the fog, I knew I couldn't leave without at least seeing her. I didn't warn her. I only wanted to watch from afar to decide for myself. After the first day of meetings, I drove to the neighborhood where she now lived, a senior apartment complex on the outskirts. My plan was to just sit in the car and stare at the building. But as if guided by an unseen hand, I walked into the little coffee shop next door. And there she was. Margaret walked in, her silver hair cut neatly short, wearing a simple wool coat. She looked nothing like the polished, haughty woman I had known. I almost didn't believe my eyes. Just then, the barista called my name, Allison. The sound made her spin around. She froze for a moment, then whispered, Allison, is that you? I nodded. My heart pounded, my hands trembling though I tried to hide it. We sat at a table by the window, a chasm stretching between us. She studied me, her eyes wavering with hesitation and fear. Her voice cracked as she asked, Are you okay? I hadn't expected that. In all those years, not once had she asked about my health or feelings. I answered simply, I'm fine. And you? She nodded, her lips quivering. I'm alive. But not like before. She told me she'd joined a support group, that the long months alone had forced her to confront the past. Then, in a lowered voice, she admitted something I never thought I would hear. I treated you terribly. Not just because I was selfish, but because I lived my whole life under your grandmother's cruelty. He called me a failure. I hated myself, and I took it out on you. I was stunned. My grandmother had died when I was little. In my hazy memories, she was gentle. But now, pieces fell into place. The heavy way my mother spoke about her, the arguments that cut short whenever I asked. The harsh cycle had stretched across generations. Margaret pulled a worn leather notebook from her purse, its cover frayed. She slid it toward me. This is the journal I've been keeping since you left. I wrote down everything. My childhood, the jealousy I felt over your bond with your father, the mistakes I made, and the steps I've tried to take to change. You don't have to read it now, but I want you to have it. I held the book, feeling the weight of more than just paper. I whispered, Mom, I don't know if I can forgive you. The wound is too deep. She nodded, her eyes brimming but her voice steady. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I only want you to know I see my faults now. If there's any chance at all, I'd like to keep some contact, even the smallest. I stayed silent for a long time. Finally, I drew a breath and said, we can start with email. No frequent visits, no phone calls. Just a few short lines when needed. Her eyes brightened as if she'd found a fragile spark of hope. That alone is enough. When we left the cafe, there were no hugs, no grand promises. But for the first time in over 30 years, something unusual stirred inside me. The truth had finally been spoken. And in that truth, maybe there was room for a different beginning, fragile but real. 2 years after that tense encounter in a small cafe on the outskirts of Boston, my life had shifted in ways I once never dared imagine. I still held my boundaries, but the connection between my mother, Margaret, and me was no longer a chain of blame. It had begun to evolve into slow, honest conversations. We started with short emails. I'd write a few lines about work and she'd reply with simple stories. Learning a new recipe in a senior cooking class, or the joy of growing lavender on her balcony. There were no demands, no comparisons, just small, ordinary exchanges. At times, I still felt wary, but with every letter, I sensed she was genuinely learning to set aside her pride. Margaret continued weekly therapy with Dr. Collins and joined her apartment community groups. From Helen, her old friend, I heard that she was now well liked for her patience and willingness to help. She worked in the shared garden, even taught a few art classes for older residents. Once I received a postcard with a hand-drawn rose, clumsy lines, but clearly made with effort. She wrote inside, "Daughter, I'm learning to see the world differently. Slowly, but I'm still learning." I sat staring at that card for a long time, feeling something I hadn't in years. Not anger, not forgiveness, but maybe the faintest trace of hope. Meanwhile, my career in Seattle entered a new chapter. I was promoted to partner at the investment firm, overseeing funds that supported divorced or widowed women. Clients trusted me not just for strategies, but because I listened with genuine empathy. I knew better than most the value of financial independence, for it had been my way out of captivity. Alongside my career, love had quietly blossomed. Ethan Parker, the gentle literature teacher I met on a hiking trip, had stayed by my side all this time. We never needed to flaunt nor chase after grand gestures. Our relationship was built on small things: reading together at night, cooking simple dinners, holding hands while walking through Seattle's misty rain. One autumn afternoon, as we climbed Rattlesnake Ledge with the cold wind sweeping across, Ethan suddenly knelt down and held out a simple, elegant ring. He said, "I can't promise you a perfect life, but I promise to walk through every hardship with you, the way you once walked through the darkness alone. Will you build a true family with me?" Tears streamed down my face as I nodded. For the first time in my life, I cried not from pain, but from the overwhelming gift of unconditional love. When I told my mother the news by email, I expected nothing. But the very next day she replied, "It would be an honor to witness your special day. But if my presence would bring you stress, I'll gladly stay home. This is your day, not mine." I sat in silence after reading those lines. The woman who once demanded the spotlight was now willing to step back. We slowly moved from emails to short phone calls, sometimes only a few minutes. I still kept distance, but I noticed her tone was different. No commands, just hesitation and sincerity. Once she told me, "I saw a little girl in the park." She handed me a crayon drawing. Instead of pointing out the flaws, I told her it was beautiful. And she beamed. I realized, that's what I should have done for you all along. That moment brought me to tears. I don't know how far this new relationship will go, but at least we've begun to respect each other as two adults. No longer mother imposing, daughter enduring. As for me, after years of chasing love I never received, I finally know. True happiness doesn't come from my mother's approval. It comes from learning to approve of myself. And once I embraced that truth, I was able to open my heart to love. From Ethan, and in a small, cautious way from the mother who is slowly changing. The day I stood in the small garden of my new home in Seattle, adjusting the lavender blossoms, I realized my journey had come full circle. From the girl who once exhausted herself chasing her mother's approval, I had become a woman who knew exactly where her worth lay. My departure years ago may have seemed cold to many. A daughter cutting ties with her aging mother, leaving her in debt and poor health. It sounded merciless. But only I understood that my disappearance was the very thing that allowed us both to change. I broke free from chains, and my mother, for the first time, was forced to face herself. With no daughter to lean on, she had to learn a different way of living. Margaret was no longer the woman who only criticized or demanded attention at parties. She learned to stand in line at the grocery store, to pay her bills on time, to say thank you when someone helped her with a bag. Small acts, but for her they were enormous steps. Most surprisingly, she learned to see me as an individual. Not her shadow, not her outlet for anger, but my own person. And I, by daring to set boundaries, found the peace I had never known. I built a career not to prove my value, but rooted in empathy. I found love with Ethan, a man who saw me simply as I was. And I learned that true love doesn't come from clinging. It comes from giving each other room to breathe, to grow, to change. Looking back, I understood. Blind sacrifice never brings love. Only when I protected myself could I open my heart to healthy relationships. Boundaries are not selfish. They are the only way to preserve the wholeness of the soul. One afternoon, as Ethan and I prepared to send out wedding invitations, I received an email from my mother. She wrote simply, "Allison, I don't expect to be at the center of your important day. If my presence weighs on you, I'll gladly celebrate from afar. But if you wish, I'll sit quietly in the back row just to see you happy." I sat still, tears spilling down. No demands, no scorn, only a simple wish to witness my joy from any distance. I replied, "Mom, I invite you. Not out of duty, but because I believe you have changed. And I have too." On my wedding day in a sunlit garden, I saw her sitting quietly in the last row, eyes red but gaze calm. For the first time, I did not fear her presence. I knew our journey would never be perfect, scars would remain. But at least it had shifted, from darkness to light, from burden to honesty. Raising my glass, I thought, sometimes the bravest thing a child can do is not endure nor rebel but walk away, to give both sides the chance to see the truth. And only in leaving can whatever love remains have the chance to take root. My story is not meant to urge anyone to sever ties. Every family is its own painting. But I believe one thing: no one should sacrifice themselves just to earn acceptance. We all have the right to set boundaries, the right to walk away when a relationship becomes toxic. And if fortune allows, that departure might teach the one left behind how to change. I looked at Ethan, then at my mother smiling faintly from afar. In that moment, I knew clearly, I had found my true home, not from the obligation of blood but from love and respect. And that was the greatest gift life had given me. Allison's story reminds us that not all family bonds equal unconditional love. Some relationships bring only hurt and control. By bravely walking away, she reclaimed her self-worth, learned to set boundaries, and built healthier connections. In real life, many face the same struggle, giving until they're drained without ever being valued. The message is clear: freedom and happiness come only when we choose to protect ourselves. What do you think about Allison's journey and her mother's transformation? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to follow the channel for more heartfelt, true stories about family and everyday life.